welcome to Black Box Talks. We have another special edition today. Super excited for today. It's a timely guest we have. So if you're new, Black Box Talks, it's a space for spatial design creatives to share their stories and experiences. It's a space for spatial experience design journeys. It's where you may find a flash of insights. It's a real life art and design conversation. It's breaking down design cliches, creating new worlds. It's theory and practice. It's emerging design philosophies and exploring unfamiliar territories. And today we have somebody super special, excited to talk to and introduce to everybody in the community here is Connie Bakshi. She was born in Atlantic City. She's an artist based here in Los Angeles, and she's trained as a classical pianist and biomedical engineer. She works predominantly with artificial intelligence, and she probes post-colonial narratives that emerge on the boundaries between the synthetic and organic, material, immaterial, the human and non-human. So that's a lot to unpack there. Excited to get into this. Her works often recode language, lore, and ritual to unfold the binaries of colonial canon. She's descended from the ancestral shamans of Taiwan. Really want to learn about this. Her accolades include the Lumen Prize, Crypto Award shortlist, with the Verse Red Dot. She's the Best of the Best Award of Concept Design and International Takafuji Arts Award. I know a little bit about that award. I got to work with Connie on this project. And her work's been exhibited with Bitforms Gallery, Ferrophile, the Knight Foundation, Feminine Art Basel Miami, Vellum Alley, Epic Gallery, the Mud Foundation, MOCDA, Lobkowitz Palace, Unpaired Gallery in Zug, and Salon Satellite in Milan, Italy. And her work in practice has been covered by Spike, Outland, Right Click Save, Forbes, and Tech Art Talks. She's an alum of the Wild XYZ Residency, the Vertical Crypto Art Residency, and New Inc., in the New Museum Incubator for Art and Technology and Design. And she has a degree from Duke University. I think that might be in engineering, I'm not sure, and Art Center College of Design. She's actually an alum of Spatial Experience Design. So having said all that, let's welcome Connie into the space here, into the Black Box Lounge.
So good to see you.
It's super good to see you too.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It really feels good to feel back at home with you. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm excited for you to share everything you do and everything you've been through in your whole design journey. And I was kind of thinking about it a little bit, and I mean, wow, what a journey you had here at Art Center, you know? I mean, starting with the first project we did together, which was your project, I think, titled Morphogenesis, you know, which is incredibly, you won the Takafuji Arts Award and you traveled to Tokyo to receive that. And it just seems like, you know, all the projects you were part of were so much about like an inner dialogue too, you know, and really sharing that kind of movement through space. Can that be design? And asking big questions. I felt like all the work you did, I don't know all the work you did here, but I think I know about 4 or 5 things you did here and some things we worked on together. And not to make it too much of a nostalgic trip, but it'd be interesting to hear about how that influenced you. But first of all, why don't you tell everybody here a little bit about your journey? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, to kind of take things way back, you know, I grew up as a cultural mutt. I like to call myself somewhere between a Taiwanese immigrant household and the American dream in Atlantic City, New Jersey. But, you know, kind of living as a mutt, this also meant living between 2 languages, which really meant that I learned both and neither. And when you live between words and worlds, I think there's just so much that goes unspoken. And there are just so many experiences that just can't be described in one language or another, right? So I think I spent a lot of my early life saying very little just because I didn't have the words for it. So I had to find other means of expression, first through music as a classical pianist. I would then go on to become a biomedical engineer in the world of neuroscience. And there I was working with songbirds to understand how communication, vocal language develops in the brain and in the body. And it really wasn't until much later that obviously I became a spatial experience designer through my time at Art Center. But I would say in more recent years, I've really translated and accumulated all of these studies into a fine art practice where, as you mentioned, I work predominantly with AI. And I think so much of my life and journey has really been about finding ways to understand the dynamics of invisible experience, specifically around otherhood. What does it mean to be other in the world, right? And then to find ways to communicate these.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So let me go back a little bit more and just ask you what made you decide to come to Art Center?
That was, I feel like I've lived so many lives, and all of these have kind of gone through a really meandering journey, right?
Yeah.
So I think, knowing that my end goal was just trying to find clarity around communication and, connect with other humans, I think starting with music. I think music was the first time where I had this opportunity to figure out how emotional and mental intent in the absence of words, right? You think about two people standing next to one another, they could be speaking to one another, but the distance between them could be miles, miles apart, right?
Mhm.
But when I was sitting on stage at the piano and playing, and the audience was, off stage, all of a sudden there's this moment where there's this synergy between me and the audience, and I feel like we're in the same space and of the same heart and mind, you know? So that was about how do I communicate this intent through of mind and emotion, right? But then engineering, I think, was really, in retrospect now, it was how does the body now find ways to communicate intent? And then I think landing at environmental design, I never saw myself as even as a musician. I wasn't thinking of myself as an artist or a designer or like a creative. But when I moved to LA, I was actually working in operations and business management for some time, but for creative firms. And seeing in interior design and advertising, I'm seeing all these creative minds and the energy and the vitality that came out of process, and the outcomes, right? And I'm looking at all this work and I'm thinking, I want to do that. That's for me. And so I started out with the Art Center at Night classes. Actually, I remember my first instructor was Chiaki Kanda, another
Mhm.
wonderful, wonderful alum. And she really fueled my passion for this. And I realized, and helped me realize, like, oh, yes, this is right. This resonates. And I need to pursue this. So soon thereafter, I applied for Art Center, got in, and that was that.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I think you really adhered to, we have that mantra of like, with spatial design, like what's that first encounter? How can you make an impact, with the audience that way? Which is not really unlike what you were doing maybe with music in a sense, but then what are the moments that can tell a story or tell the narrative, and then what's that lasting impression, and I think we still kind of stick with that mantra even today, which makes it very different than other environmental design practices or even architecture, in a sense I think has gone astray in that way. I'm excited about what's being explored in architecture, but I feel like that aspect, which sometimes now we're actually using the term scenography too, and in scenography, if you take it back, beyond theater, I think Joseph Zabota, the Viennese, director, kind of coined the idea that like design isn't space. Design is people doing the thing in the space. And I feel like now that I think about this, it really aligns with kind of your interest in how you transform from what you were doing into this area, and now you're into another area. I think so.
Yeah, when I started the program, it was called environmental
Mhm.
design. And so I was thinking, oh, okay, now this is about finding ways to translate a narrative or an intent through space. But having gone through the program, I actually love now that it's spatial experience design because it is about the interaction and movement of people through a time space continuum, right? It's
Yeah, well, I mean that's kinesthetics too, right? So kinesthetics, I think, is something that it kind of struck me when I just was thinking about the work you did here and some of the work that we got to do together a little bit. I felt like kinesthetics is something of that, and that's always a question: can you design movement through space? Is that a design in itself? And I feel like that's something you've been, kind of interested in your own practice also.
And it's also it's not just about designing the movement. It's about oh, I feel like there's a beautiful thing when you can't control the movement, right? You can't control the movement, but you can. What you the only thing, once again, can control is intent. Does in how people serendipitously move, are they jiving with what you're trying to say?
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, and I think playing with, you know, the sequence, the pacing, the cadence of moving through a design, you know, it no matter what that work is something to be considered. I think in spatial design, of course, we're like, hey, physically, this is the way we do it,
Of course.
and you know, not to move too far along yet, but I think you're in a different realm, and I'm wondering if you do you think about that? Do you think about how do what the first encounter of the way people take in your work, and does that work with your intention?
I think about it all the time because honestly, clarity of intention is the end goal of I think art and design. And I think I can speak to a recent project. I
Sure.
recently finally I took my work with AI and artwork, and I was challenged to finally present this natively digital artwork that's usually screen based into a massive, 3 LED wall floor projection, like basically warehouse space. Um, and it, I had to think about, yes, I had to think about sequence and in the moment, like what's this moment in which my artwork appears? What tone does that set? And then in the movement within the artwork itself, I have to think about the distance between the audience and the screens or the surface, and then the sound that's encompassing and enveloping the audience. How is it now reflecting a larger mythological world,
Mhm.
that I'm telling?
Yeah.
And then even thinking about the duration of it, right?
Mhm.
Um, I basically was with the brief, I was given 22 seconds to deliver something that was potent and clear. And that certainly created a lot of narrative constraints as well. But kind of thinking through all these different points of interaction and sequence and time, like that really helped me, I think, create a very what from what I heard and what I understand, something that did communicate clearly.
Yeah. That's awesome. And I think, and we're living in a world now too where, I mean, we're very, you know, ocular centric in a way, right? We see it first, we understand it first in that way. And having someone moving through a body of work that is maybe digitally conceived in a sense too, is like, how can you tease that in the haptic way, you know? And the haptic, and you know, we talk about the haptic senses in the way Kenya Hart describes it is teasing the senses. And then when you think about of course, we're ocular centric even more so than ever. That's the way we understand the world. How can you tease those senses? And I know that your work gets very personal in that way, and the narratives you're trying to tell. But how's that as a challenge?
I have to go back to when I first started working with AI. And maybe I can kind of delve into that
Sure.
story and lead haptic. So, I like to say that 2021 was actually the year that I merged with AI. And to be honest, it was totally serendipitous, right? I was co running this art practice that manifested in experiential installations and performance art. But that was, uh, then the pandemic hit, and we had so many shutdowns, and in that I was completely cut off from the resources and venues that were integral to my practice, right? So I found it was something, actually it was a good thing because it gave me the time and the headspace to really reevaluate my art and to reconsider the questions I wanted to pursue in my practice. So my friend Phil Boshua, who's like the serial inventor, serial entrepreneur, was working with some of the most cutting edge AI models at the time. And, I shared kind of my artistic vision and my goals with him. And he was so, so generous. He invited me to join his Art Meets Tech AI incubator, where he just gave me free reign to every single one of these custom models. And I think then working within this digitally native environment, screen-based environment of AI introduced this alternative dimension to craft, right? Where I had to learn how to cultivate the sensual and emotional expression without relying on haptic feedback. Because, AI does not have the same sensory organs that we do. These AI models are not imbued with those. Um, and so if I'm trying to collaborate now with AI, how do I bring out things that people can have to respond to? That really took me completely throwing out any ideas and preconceived notions I had about AI and how it works, um, to be able to try to achieve this. And I think what was interesting was that this process was complicated by a very language centric interface, both with GPT, or text chat models, but also text to image models, which are once again language based. And it became very, very that my understanding and communication of language was completely different from the way AI models understand and communicate language. And really, I, I had to break language to find the haptic, which is I think which is extraordinary and magical, right? The fact that language cannot suffice to describe these haptic to talk about haptic and haptic experiences, and yet you can find a way to, for lack of a better term, or break and leverage language to achieve that.
That's super wild. I mean, I was just thinking of, I guess Alexander Mardu, the futurist, says something like, you know, uh, a knife to a chef is how we should think about AI as a creative, but I was thinking, well, I don't know, that kind of has holes in it too, because a knife is learning. I don't know. I think it's your hand that's doing the fine cutting, but it feels like you're using it in a way to manipulate and kind of collaborate in a sense to
Well,
create what you want to do.
I kind of agree and disagree with the knife analogy, because okay, yes, you can use a knife as a tool if you see, a craftsman or an artisan using, that's just from the outside in, right? But in the event of the craftsman or artisan, the master wielding the tool, the interesting thing is the feedback loop that occurs between the tool and the user, right? Where it's the sensation of resistance, um, and that in turn informs how, you know the user is going to wield the knife, and how he or she adjusts the pressure, the move, etc. So it's really about feedback loops, not about an input output relationship. Um, so in that sense, the knife analogy kind of works, kind of, if you really kind of look at it in terms of that relationship,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is really a great, I think, conversation that designers need to hear too, because when you say feedback loop too, from my background, I can say, well, that's process, and I think, the big fear here is that, oh, well, using AI and you're getting this outcome. Well, I think what we're talking about over here too is like, well, that's a tool, but I think the way we weld it, the way we use it, the process in which we engage in it, is like, how do we share that? Is part of the process. So it's not like we're just using it as a means to have this outcome. It's kind of like we're using it as a creation mode. And also one thing in terms of the tactility, I know that when you were, because then after the Takafuji, just for a second, well, tiny flashback, you studied in Tokyo at Tama University, and you were, I think, working with the urushi artists, and right. So I'm probably taking you way back, but just the extreme kind of process of application, and I think that's actually kind of toxic too, right? I mean, that kind of
Did you say
toxic, isn't that kind of toxic? The lacquer.
incredibly, it's urushi, the lacquer is derived from a plant that shares DNA with poison oak, basically. And so breathing in it's a living substance that you're working with that could kill you in the long run, really. um, but there's this wonderful push and pull between material and, living object and self as you're sculpting it, right?
So this is an awesome analogy, and and code of metaphor, right? This is an analogy, right, for the way in which we're thinking about using these tools in a sense.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Because when I think about the Rishi process, so much of that was, you think about craft, you think about process, and somehow we're codified to think of it's about control,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not. It's about yielding to yielding to the response of a material, yielding to the response of the tool. And in that sense, say for instance with a ruchi, it's like, okay, you've got a base surface, right? And then you have to kind of cultivate and mix the urushi with certain that'll help it, or with certain substances that will help it adhere to the surface, right? But then there's a filtration process with all of that. Try to get the right consistency. But then once you actually lay the urushi onto the surface, what people don't realize is that these beautiful Japanese lacquerware pieces, the ones that are true to the process, require hundreds of layers of application. And with each layer, you're applying you're applying the urushi, you're letting it dry in a humidity and heat controlled environment, but then you're sanding it down again. You're sanding it down, and you don't necessarily know how it's going to respond based on the conditions, right? That it's been cured in. It's never quite as you expect, um, and so once again, like this idea of working with a living material that will surprise you in its response, and then you in turn have to respond to it, um, to try to find um, try to find an outcome that's an intersection of what the material will give you and what you want.
Well, so it's a very careful, curated, delicate process, right?
And it's time intensive, labor intensive.
Sorry, we had a little accident here. Um, yeah, so it's a very delicate process. So I want you to respond to this, okay? So there may be 4 or 5, levels of computation and humans and computers, okay? And it kind of relates to this Yurishi thing about the way you did that process. And I would tell people, hey, our first computers are these mainframe computers the size of this building, right? And we're inputting some information, some data comes out. Our second phase of computers is personal computing. And, these machines are looking at us, we're looking at it. And the third phase of computing would really be almost like calm computing. It's happening in the background, and sometimes it seems like we don't care, like it's making our environment comfortable. It's doing these things for us. It's telling us we need to like buy more dog food or whatever. But it's like, and so for me, I feel like we're in the 3.5 realm, or maybe more. Maybe you can elaborate on this, or please help me out here, is, because it sounds like it can be passive. AI, we're using AI, we're doing it when we wake up in the morning. Everybody is using AI tools, right? By just accessing your phone. But what you're talking about is really like critically harnessing and using it as a tool and not thinking about it passively. Because I think we can't escape that either, passively. But as an emerging AI artist, it feels like, wow, so this is actually these are paintbrushes in a way. This is like a new way of thinking through. But what would you say to that? I mean, that level of what I was mentioning in terms of evolution.
Yeah, I have to say, like, first and foremost, I mean, when we say AI in conversation now, somehow everyone tends to think of this AI as like an all-encompassing like entity, right? But really, there are so many different kinds of AI models. I think that's the first thing that people need to recognize. And the fact is, the most pervasive ones are, yes, the ones that are operating in the background. And, you talk about the ones that are on our devices and that, kind of mediate our interaction with screens. But the fact is, AI is so pervasive, it's influencing life off. Like, even if we were to disconnect from our devices and screens, it's still influencing our lives, like our financial decisions, the news that we hear, etc. Like, um, and the fact is, those kinds of AI models are really harnessing the power of prediction, right? Where it's taking, like you said, these massive data sets, like just, trawling through them and trying to extrapolate future predictive outcomes, what I'm much more interested in my process with AI is it's something that I would call the perceptual switch, right? How can we now not hack an AI model, work with AI models to move away from prediction, rather focus on this notion of perception, right? So sure, we could still have these massive data sets, but in the feedback loop that occurs in the process of working with, for me, like the GPT models, the text to image models, it really starts to reveal blind spots, not only in the biases of the collective consciousness that are digitally documented in the data sets, but also biases in how I think. Um, and I think this is actually where I would love to see more focus in AI. How can we now move away once again from prediction? And I think the processing power and the ability for these neural networks to synthesize data can actually help us have much deeper and exponentially, like, you know, complicated understanding of ourselves, like who we are. Um, does that somewhat answer your question?
Well, yeah, actually, this is a great segue because I would love for you to maybe introduce us. And this is interesting because we're just having a conversation here. You're not sharing your work, which I kind of like because we have this dialogue. But could you share a bit about your work and what your intention is to achieve either in the process or when, people encounter the work? What is it you're trying to do, or what is it you're exploring?
Yeah, I'll try not to get too esoteric here because I feel like ever since I've worked with AI, my head has sort of been in the cosmos or in the ether at all times.
Yeah, that's
Right.
okay.
So I'll go back to, if AI is this digital archive of our documented collective knowledge, ways of thinking, and our memory of experience across time, you know, I like to think that I hack, I abstract, and I deconstruct language, the interface of AI, to trigger anomalies that I think suggest these blind spots in our perceived realities. And I think oftentimes my work lives in the realm of ritual and lore. And I think this framework is really important to me because these are vehicles of repetition that bridge generations across time and reinforce certain codifications in how we think and how we perceive and interact with the world. And I think the power of the repetition of ritual and lore through time is that they can ingrain and they can amplify and perpetuate values, certain values that society we've collectively deemed valuable. But at the same time, I think this repetition can render these values, I would say, frozen or static over time. And so, in a lot of ways, the codes that we're kind of abiding by, the values that we're abiding by, are just kind of become like this involuntary, like zombie-like Pavlovian response. Um, and so over generations, these codes embedded in ritual and lore continue to silently reinforce and form our identities and relationships with one another. So I think, for instance, a lot of things, one of the things that I really love to do is, I'll gather and accumulate massive troves of mythologies around, I think, where there's like an intersection, right? And I'll feed these into AI. So say, for instance, recently I was looking at if I were to throw maybe like three words out at you, you might have this concept of what that is. So if I were to say serpent, woman, choice, where does your mind go? Right?
Mhm.
So um, I won't answer that for you, but I
I
think
have an image.
right.
Yeah.
So a lot of the research I did as I was gathering mythologies and lore across cultures, across geographic divides, was looking at these three words and where they kind of popped up. And when I started collecting these stories and feeding them into AI, um, I, I, the process for me actually started with narrative in terms of how can we reform meet these mythologies that now bloom from the intersection of all these different worldviews. And then how do I now translate that into something that's not a Western dominated canon, but something that kind of crosses the divides between once again geographies and cultures.
There's a, there's a lot there, Connie, for sure. I mean, and it's really, I think what you're doing is really important work too, because I feel like we use these tools for, instant gratification and our dopamine rush and all these things. How can we make our life quicker and easier? But you're saying what you're doing is using these tools to kind of look back and and using like lore, which I think are maybe stories and mythologies left behind, and ritual, which ritual seems to be missing in a lot of life now too. And in taking these ideas, that are ancient, we're all connected somehow, ancestrally to these notions, and then using new tool sets to investigate. And some of the things you're talking about in mythology, I started to think about, a hero of a thousand faces, power of myth. And I think that's just the one incredible thing that Joseph Campbell arrived at, was that there's all these similarities or crossovers with religion and mythology and folklore, and that we never really looked at history that way before. I think, not to that depth, we don't understand history that way, but I think he was touching on that, while he was here. And I think that a little bit is what you're doing with these new tool sets. But I think, is this also challenging too? Because if you think about whatever that collective knowledge is that we have in these, this intelligence, come on, there's bias in that too. So that must be super challenging to think about that bias. And can you make an effect in bringing a different intelligence that's new, intelligence that's not with the built-in biases that exist now?
Yeah, I think the biases come out of, once again, the data sets, right? And I think oftentimes a lot of the consumer grade AI models are based on, well, obviously biased data sets, as we've seen, we've talked about. But when you start training AI models on curated sets, right, you have an opportunity to you can't ever dismiss, you can't ever discard bias. Bias will always exist in any single person's like worldview. But what you can do is, in a way, confuse the machine enough for it to try to find intersections and synergies between disparate binaries, right? And for me, I could try to tackle every single bias in every single data set, but ultimately, I think, simplistically, I have to start with the West versus the East. And something that comes out of colonial histories that are very near to my family history and the generations before. Um,
Well, I love this track. It's sort of like, if you think about what's the heirloom, and I think about, okay, so, my dad lived to be 101 years old, and, he had a drawer of these old photos, and I would be like, oh, who's this interesting person? That was your great uncle, or this is so-and-so. And like, you kind of piece together these stories. Um, and I think about, well, what do we leave behind, for our loved ones? What do we leave behind? A bunch of old laptops, old hard drives. Like, what is an heirloom, and what do we leave behind? And I'm wondering if you ever thought about that. And you're a mom, so too, and you start to think about these things, too. It's like, what is it you leave behind today? It's not what your parents left or your grandparents. It's like, we have a plethora of these things that we don't really need anymore. They don't have that. They're not imbued with that kind of meaning. For a lot of people, I think. But what kind of, can this work have something to do with this idea of what a future heirloom might
oh,
be?
that's such a beautiful question, James. I really love that, and I think it's so important to me because I do think about it quite a bit. And as a child of diaspora, so my parents, possessions, and their parents, generations before, things have been lost through time and geography. Um, and I think what I've come to realize, what I see as the heirloom that persists is the stories that we tell and the values that we we imbue these stories with, right? What are the values that we kind of pass on? And, how do these stories all shape, right? And that's what heirlooms, you think of objects, that's what they are. They're a story, a handheld story. But now, because we have so many modalities to work with in terms of storytelling, how can, the, how can that, the manifestation of a narrative become become what's passed
Yeah.
on?
Yeah, I'm really, really curious as to what shape that does. And to add a little bit to the future heirloom idea, it's like, I wanted to say, your generation, or generation now, is like the most photographed generation in the world, yet don't have photos.
Yeah.
So those aren't the precious things, you know. Remember, we tried to make the digital picture frame.
Oh my God.
That didn't work.
No, it really didn't.
Oh,
I know, and I was the other night, I was talking to I was putting my son to bed. He's 5 now. And so of course there's lots of big feels and lots of things that he's processing to try to understand what the heck is going on, right? At all
yeah.
times. Uh, well, actually what he was on an East Coast trip with dad, and I was far away, and then that night Bodie, my son, stayed with his grandparents, and they were tasked with putting him to bed. But because dad had to take a work, had to take a work meeting that evening. And so I get a call from grandma, a FaceTime, and my Bodie shows up on the screen, and he's in tears. And he's like, "Oh, I miss you so much. Can you and Daddy just come home? Can you come home to me? I can't take it." Basically, is what he's saying. And he's kind of hysterical, and he can't quite be soothed. And out of I hadn't really been thinking about this, but I asked him, "Have you ever heard of something called the invisible thread?" And he's like, and he kind of stops for a moment. He's like, "Oh, what's that? What's that?" I was like, "Okay, look, when you form a relationship and you develop a bond of love between yourself and another person, there's an invisible thread that connects your hearts, right? And that invisible thread cannot be seen, it cannot be felt, but it exists." And he stops for a moment, and he thinks, and he asks, "Can it break? Can it break?" And there's a little bit of terror in his eyes, and I'm telling him, no, it can be stretched infinitely, it can collapse infinitely, it will always exist, not break. um, and I kind of repeated the story to him in different ways. He started to be soothed. And then, much later, after he'd gone to bed, I was kind of thinking to myself, I was like, "Oh, the invisible thread. Like, where's this coming from? This is not this was just a story that I was telling my son to try to soothe him, but it's based in, I think about the red thread of fate in Asian cultures. But then I'm thinking, like, biologically, like we think of mycelial networks and how they communicate and connect, life, plant-based life forms. Um, and I believed it to be true. And I was thinking, this is the kind of story, and this is the kind of heirloom that I want my son to remember, and maybe he can soothe his child, years from now, if he remembers this moment. Um, I went off on such a tangent there. I'm so sorry. And now I've lost my train of thought.
No, no, but that's the interconnectedness, I think, and this idea of what we leave behind. And I mean, to kind of get back to your work and connecting and bringing to life the lore and the ritual of, where you come from, and how we leave that beyond is. So my question is on your work, is do you come upon it with a familiarity, unfamiliarity, or is that important? So meaning like um, an aspect of culture. So whether it's like textile or pattern or color or just aspect of apparel or something, is there? Do you use these as cues to create the work? Is there aspects of it so that someone could come upon it and say, "I feel connected to this somehow, but I don't know how"? Um, or is the work so phenomenal in a sense that we don't have a we don't connect, we just see something new and we're trying to understand what it is?
I think the best way to answer that question is that I feel like the basis, from which I derive a lot of my work and process, starts with fragments, whether that be fragments of an idea, fragments of a story, or even fragments of ephemera, right? So there have been times where I've taken film negatives and I've scanned them, and then I've pulled those into AI, text to image models, and started to kind of extrapolate and pull and use language to manipulate these. And the film negatives I would use, for instance, would be like the handful of negatives from like my grandparents, right? And those kind of become the basis of this idea of, like, oh, what now in where I'm asking, in this relationship between machine and human, that's inextricable from the past, what is this idea of becoming, right? So say for instance, if I were to say, I'm taking these film negatives and these scans as a minoritized data set and seeping it into a consumer grade model. Now, as having a conversation with AI, trying to sculpt the fabric of this data set, you, I start to negotiate, I think, the territories of influence between the original data set and the imposition of the dominant code that's in the consumer grade model. And so what becomes interesting in the process is that with every single succession or successive generation of image, it actually reflects this threshold or this boundary condition on which the becoming is contested. And so I think, let's say in that kind of process, so I'm thinking about in a relationship between machine and human that's once again inextricable from the past, is this sense of becoming just an endless repetition of our histories? Or can it be the cultivated seed of some unseen and unknown future that still intersects with the distant past?
Wow.
Sorry, I know I probably, I'm
No,
don't
no,
coffee now.
I'm into that. I think we've met before some other time in some other land, I think. So, um, but I mean, what it shows, what I'm hearing too, is I think the richness and depth that you put into these explorations and these processes is going to fully affect the outcome and almost make some cosmic connection because I've seen your work and there's something that's eerie and connected in the same time, and I think that's what makes it successful. Um, and not just like this aha moment, but more like there's I guess you could say a mystery to it, and I think we all have those mysteries, and I think that carries through, and I think that's probably important, for you,
Yeah,
and the work that you're doing.
glad that comes across. Yeah, it's sometimes I can try to clarify as much as I can in on the front end of the front end and through the process itself, but sometimes once you release the work into the world, you don't know exactly what's going to come through.
Yeah,
So it means a lot.
yeah, for sure. I mean, if you can't probably read this as backwards, but it says create meaning and beauty out of the chaos of life, and I think that's something that you're trying to achieve with that, and it's admirable to think of the intention and how you go back, and I think that'll be meaningful to your son and to people, I think culturally to kind of have those cues and bring that forward and new ways because we have new ways of seeing, and new tool sets. So I think that's really important. And I mean, this is a great conversation because I haven't really talked to you about your work. So I'm enjoying like the inception of it. There's a lot of meaning to it. And I think there's a point too where you really kind of have that, you go inside and go deep to pull out, something a story that you want to share. And therefore it's a different kind of lore, maybe, and maybe there's new rituals associated with this that we don't know yet.
I don't know. We'll see what happens. But I will say, to me, the artworks that I release are also, in my mind, not personally, they're not the art itself. The art itself is the process and what I've gotten out of it and how it answers the questions that I'm asking. In a lot of ways, the art that I release of the the symptom of the process, of the thought process, the sculpting process, the crafting process, and that's so much more important to me. But it jives with me that the symptom of the process is something that people can connect with.
I think so. So I mean, have you gotten this kind of response, or what do you hear about your work? What are the responses people give you on your work?
Oh gosh, I think it's so broad and so varied, and I will say, sometimes it hits people in a really hard way, without me having to explain or contextualize, where they're like, "Oh, there's just something here," and it pulls like a gut response for me, and I can't put my finger on it. And then we have the conversation, right? And I'm like, okay, well, this is what I was thinking. This is the question I was kind of asking myself at the time. And then, their eyes light up and they're like, oh, I get it. get it. And that's a beautiful thing because suddenly I feel like there's a spark of understanding connection between me and this viewer, you know? Um, I've had some people just, maybe just even focus like an aesthetic, right? Or something that's they say, oh, okay, this is something that just makes me stop short or stop in my tracks. Once again, I can't put my finger on it. I want to know more. And I'm like, great, because then that if that can invite conversation, much more conversation with me about, what I'm thinking about, then that's, that's success.
Well, maybe there's something dreamlike about it too. And I think people have an interesting relationship with that too. And if you think about it being dreamlike or oniric in that sense, there's those subterranean forces. And those subterranean forces, there's a lot there, and it's not always scary, but there's stuff there that I think connects back to where you're reaching for, and you're reaching back. I think, right? I feel kind of culturally, ancestrally, you're reaching back to that, bring that forward. And then I think in a sense we can all connect to that, and sometimes we don't want to, but we do. We're beckoned to do that.
I think since I began my art practice, there's been this, I realized I need to live in this state of constant open vulnerability. I guess that. Uh, but I think that's maybe something that that just kind of comes through in my work. And also, I will kind of just go back to something you'd said about reaching back and pulling it forward. Actually, I think if you reach far enough into the past and far enough into the future at the same time, the two actually meet. Um, and I think that intersection is kind of where I'm trying to land in my tone. And maybe that's why there's some sort of both familiarity and terror that people might respond to. Oh, that is something somebody had once told me. They said my work is both, evocative, sometimes erotic, but also terrifying.
Yeah, it touches a lot of nerves, and in that way I think it's haptic, in that way, if it can make you feel that way. And I mean, what would ideally, how would you want people to approach the work, like in what kind of condition would be the ultimate space to see Connie's work, do you feel, the way you want them to get the full experience?
If I were to place my work in a physical environment, I would say, actually, with every exhibition, the work is site specific. The work is always site specific. I can't just displace it from or pull it from my screen, upload it to a server, and hope it shows up on a screen somewhere in a physical space. I don't believe in that. The ideal condition where I understand the nature of the space, the gallery, the museum, whatever that is being shown in, even the cultural context. And then, that's how I begin to form,
Mm,
I think, the experience around the artwork itself.
yeah, I love that. That's really interesting. That reminds me of, I don't know if you're familiar with Chris Cornell from
Yes.
New Mexico, right? So, I mean, he's been collecting data from, just ancient data of a landscape or a people or the ecology of the place, and using that to inform the work that he does. And I think it's really important to be able to kind of pull that through, and we can use these tool sets because we can collect that. We can kind of see back what was there, what had happened, and how can we bring these stories to kind of merge together. Um,
Kind of work doesn't operate in, I mean, artwork, that it doesn't operate in isolation. I think that defeats the purpose. It has to not only have a dialogue with an audience, but with the space around it, with the landscape, with the culture, with the sense of place in which it sits. I think that's where this multi-layered experience is one that can amplify the narrative of the work and the work itself.
is audio a part of it?
You know what? When I first started out, it was just so I felt like working with AI and was so complicated and difficult to kind of navigate that I held off on that for quite some time. But only in more recent artwork have I started incorporating audio. And this is something that I want to continue exploring because obviously, as a classical musician, I understand the power of sound, acoustics, and even lyrical melody in um, guiding people state of mind, but also through a specific narrative. Um, I think, yeah, I actually am. I love when I left off playing piano, I was starting to get into Schoenberg and more of the atonal composers who are, and in more recent years, I'm like totally into John Cage because it's about
Right.
what
Right.
music, what constitutes sound, and is there something in it that can now evoke a very specific response. So this is definitely something I've been folding into my practice, exploring quite a bit.
Have you thought about, I mean, is there some aspect of music, indigenous music or something back then that you could bring to this classical aspect too, And then in between you mentioned like surrealist sounds. So it feels like that's a whole area that could be really intriguing for you to play with.
Absolutely. It's a super fascinating, a lot to kind of unpack because, having grown up in the classical music discourse, you start to realize how, once again, the influences, the Western dominated
Right.
influence in classical music specifically. And, as I've started to do research into tribes from which I'm descended, the Sarayan tribe, there's a very rich musical heritage, very rich percussive heritage
Mhm.
around certain rituals and lore. Um, so that's definitely something I'm being drawn as I kind of go deeper into my practice.
Yeah. Well, this is an awesome conversation, Connie. We get to get together again. We could go on. Um, but I think, it's almost an hour and I want to see if anybody has any questions here. And if there are, feel free to ask and I'll ask Connie.
Lots of emojis.
I know
I,
that's nice.
I'll, words cannot express.
That's right. That's right. Um, so Connie, like, what would you like to, I mean, how can people find out what you're doing and what are you doing next that you want to share?
Oh gosh. Um, you know, I kind of I take it day by day.
Okay.
So
Okay.
first, where can you find my work?
Yes.
Um, process of updating my website, conniebakshi.com. So that's certainly, kind of look out for that in the next month. There is some, kind of an older website that has older works. But I would say actually I've been in a lot of ways, I'm starting to see Instagram posts as kind of like a historical documentation of exhibitions and past work. So you'll find a lot of recent stuff there. In terms of what's coming up next, holistically, I'm in the process of trying to build a world around this concept of xenogenesis, right? Um, and kind of pulling in these hybrid mythologies, but also thinking about the hybridity between humans and machines, humans and the non-human other, right? And kind of the emergence that takes place. And so I think a lot of the more recent works that I've been releasing actually stem from this world and are part of building it. Um, and then, in the meantime, I have exhibitions coming up, one in Villacañas, Spain, which is east of Toledo and south of Madrid, where I'll be releasing a body of work, a new series. Um, and, I have some more releases coming up, but all of those I'll be posting diligently on my Instagram and hopefully updating my website.
Well, thanks so much for sharing and not sharing because we're sharing this dialogue and we're not able to see it, but we're all in this kind of unfamiliar territories, and you've kind of like dove into this head first, and so I mean you're a friend I really wanted to talk to about this and share with our community of designers here. So thanks so much, and we'll be excited to see what you do next. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed the
Oh,
chat.
this was so wonderful. It makes me want to, I'm gonna scoop you up, steal you, and we're gonna go have hours long chat to continue the
Absolutely.
conversation.
We're going to have you over here
Okay,
too. But
yeah.
no, but seriously, this is in all design institutions. We're all trying to figure out what's next, in terms of like how we teach and what we teach, and what's relevant, and some people are scared of it and some people aren't. And so, we're just trying to figure all this out right now. So,
It's definitely a time of ambiguity,
mhm.
ideology,
Yeah.
around, but it's also an incredible time, a really, really incredible time, opportunity,
It's
right?
exciting. And thanks for putting yourself out there so we can like watch your journey too and see what you do with it.
Well, thanks for following it. It
All
means
right.
everything.
It's awesome. Thank you, Connie.
Thanks,
Thanks,
James. See you around.
everybody. All right. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.